name's Cara Philpott, and I'm currently on the lands of the Bibbulmun and Kuniyoung people of the Noongar Nation in a small regional town in the southwest of Western Australia. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of their land and their continuing connection to land, waters, and community, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And I wish to acknowledge all First Nations people joining this webinar. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening, and of course, Anne Single, CEO of Patient Voice Initiative, who is kindly driving the webinar logistics behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Anne. I've no doubt many of you will be familiar with Associate Professor Sarah Norris and Eric Low. Sarah is an Associate Professor of Practice, Health Technology Assessment at the Leeder Centre for Health Policy, Economics and Data at the University of Sydney. Sarah is also Co-Deputy Chair of the Medical Services Advisory Committee, Chair of the MSAC Evaluation Subcommittee, or ESC, and she has almost, or probably over 30 years of experience in HTA evaluating pharmaceuticals, vaccine, medical devices, diagnostic tests, public health programs. Her research interests encompass the methods used to evaluate the effectiveness and cost-effectiveness of emerging health technologies, with a particular focus on genomics and digital health, and how we can better integrate ethics and equity considerations in HTA. Eric has worked in medical research, health technology appraisal, market access, health policy, and patient organisations for over 30 years. He established Myeloma UK in 1996, developing it from an idea into a successful, respected organisation, which he led as Chief Executive until 2017. During this time, he designed and implemented a disease blueprint and bench-to-bedside strategic model to accelerate and prioritise the discovery, development, and access to effective new treatments, as well as best practice and information and support for patients and their families. In 2017, Eric established a small specialist consultancy specialising primarily in strategic HTA and market access, as well as life sciences, healthcare policy, and patient group involvement and engagement. Eric also holds several board positions, honorary, advisory, and voluntary positions. He also advises numerous medical and health-focused charities on a pro bono basis. He was awarded an OBE for services to charity in the Queen's Birthday Honours of 2017. It's quite an impressive lineup we have here tonight. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box during the presentations. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentations, and if we're unable to answer all of the questions, I will endeavour to provide a response outside of this webinar. Before I hand over to the speakers, I'll provide some definitions of key concepts that we will be talking about this evening, particularly in those that may be new to health technology assessment. I thought you might benefit from this. Sorry, my slides are going all around the place. Okay. I will start that in a moment, but first I just wanted to provide some context around why this topic is so meaningful for myself. As a mother of a child with a rare disease, I became interested in new drugs and new therapies and how they develop, but of course I wanted to understand how to get access to these emerging therapies. I became an active patient advocate, including serving currently as Chair of Neuromuscular WA, and I recently graduated with a Master of Health Economics. And I can count on one hand the number of times that patient data and patient input was mentioned during the Master's program. So here I am trying to bridge the gap between my textbook knowledge of HTA and lived experience to unpack how patient data is used in economic modelling. I believe using patient data and input through HTA processes is key to providing more equitable and timely access to new treatments. So the theme of tonight was around the black box. And this is the purpose of the webinar, to elaborate on how patient data can be used in economic modelling for health technology assessment. Have you ever wondered what happens inside the black box of economic modelling? What happens with patient data? These are some of the questions that I had when I discovered my fascination with HTA and economic modelling. I was amused by this particular definition of a black box model where it's not very clear what goes on inside the model. We're all generally aware that data goes in, something happens in the middle, and out comes an output. And that output sometimes is an answer or a number or a ratio. But by the end of this webinar, I hope that those internal mechanisms of economic modelling are less hidden and a little more intelligible. Before we go to that, I will cover the concepts of health technology assessment, economic modelling, and patient data. And please note that I will use the term patient rather than consumer, although consumer is most often used in Australia. And I use the term patient during this webinar to distinguish the important use of data coming specifically from patients rather than from a broader sense of consumer input. Okay, so to start initially with a definition and description of what are health technologies. This can include pharmaceutical inventions, medicines, and vaccines. It can include medical and healthcare technology, such as diagnostic tests, medical procedures, devices, prostheses, and human tissue products. Screening can include newborn screening, carrier screening programs, and other forms of health technologies. HTA, or Health Technology Assessment, is critical in linking clinical evidence to inform policy. HTA provides a systematic, evidence-based evaluation to understand the comparative benefits within the value of health technologies and allows governments, payers, and insurance to decide which technologies will be adopted, reimbursed, and prioritised. And no country or health system in the world will be able to provide its population with all the technologies that have been proven effective. And given the abundance of new and often extremely expensive technologies and very limited health resource budgets, the cost benefit consideration is critical in making healthcare decisions, especially around reimbursement. Patient involvement in HTA processes is increasingly recognised. Sorry, my notes are making my slides skip a bit through, so sorry about that. But patient involvement in HTA processes is increasingly recognised as pivotal for informed, equitable, and patient-centric healthcare decision-making. So I look at the health technology assessment in Australia, where the majority of our webinar participants are based. HTA is used for market authorisation for regulation, which looks at safety and efficacy, and HTA for Australian government subsidy, which really looks at is it value for money. Australians benefit from HTA to ensure that taxpayers' money supports safe, effective healthcare improvements. HTAs are conducted in Australia not only by the HTA bodies such as the Medical Services Advisory Committee, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, and the Medical Devices and Human Tissue Advisory Committee, but also by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which focuses primarily on that safety, quality, and efficacy of new technologies. It's fantastic that new treatments and therapies are available in Australia, which after they pass through the Therapeutic Goods Administration is wonderful, but most patients would not be able to afford the new technology without reimbursement. Moving on to patient data and looking at why this is important, I really liked the image that's available, or which you can view on the right-hand side of your screen, which determines and distinguishes the difference between patient participation in HTA processes and patient data or patient-based evidence that can be considered alongside clinical and economic evidence. So although we want patients involved in the process, we also want data that can be critically assessed and ensures that the clinical data is considered in conjunction with the lived reality, expectation, and values of patients. And patients are often underrepresented in generating economic evidence to inform reimbursement decisions. In this process, patient inputs are critical to make sure that the value and importance of the new technology for their health is taken into consideration. This is important as the decision that comes at the end of the HTA process can play a major role in patients' health. If patients can clearly add value to the HTA questions, isn't it possible that patients could also inform the economic model design? And I'll ask Eric to explore that concept a little bit later. The most common types of data include health-related quality of life data, which is often patient-reported and is essential for cost-utility analyses. The examples can include using tools such as the EQ5D, the SF36, preference-based quality of life instruments, PROMs that can be converted into utilities for quality-adjusted life year calculations, And that type of data around health-related quality of life data allows quantification of how treatments affect daily functioning and well-being and converting patient experiences into utility values which can be used in economic models. Patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs, many of you will have heard this term before, and that's used not only for clinical evidence, but also to support quality-adjusted life year calculations, disease-specific benefits in modelling, long-term projections of treatment impact. And some examples of this might include pain intensity, symptom burden, functional status, and emotional well-being. And it's important because PROMs show how patients feel and function. Looking at patient preference data, it's increasingly used to weight outcomes and attributes that matter the most to patients and inform value pricing decisions. Examples can include trade-offs which patients are willing to make between benefits and side effects and preferences about treatment mode or frequency. It's important as patient preference studies show what patients want from treatment and care. There's a couple of other types of data that can be collected, which is data collected about patients rather than for or with patients, which might include clinical outcomes data, which can include survival rates, mortality data, and disease progression. And other data that can be included is adverse events and safety data, such as side effects and complications. The other two types of data that I wanted to cover related to resource use, healthcare data, healthcare utilisation data, which capture the cost side of the economic evaluation. And that can include hospital admissions, outpatient visits, use of diagnostics, medication use, which can be quantified relatively easily. And that's important to understand how often and how intensively patients use healthcare resources to allow the calculation of direct medical costs. Outside of the direct medical costs, patient costs must also be considered, and that's expenses outside of the formal healthcare system, which might include travel costs or parking to attend appointments, home modifications, out-of-pocket spending on medications or devices, and especially productivity losses from missed work or reduced work capacity. Those types of costs are important for societal perspective evaluations as it looks at the broader economic burden of disease. And I hope you don't mind if I do a shout out here to two organisations. If you'd like more information about patient preferences, Patient Voice Initiative have a training module in the Patient Voice Hub. And patient organisations starting out in this space, organisations like Capri are available to help undertake research projects to provide patient data across a range of settings to generate evidence and to support reimbursement. The economic model. One of the questions that I think is always asked is, why do we need a model? And it's to stimulate real-world evidence. A model is a simplification of the real world, considering only the important components from the perspective to be analysed. A good model allows us to calculate the odds of events occurring by the diverse decisions that can be made, and also knowing how likely it is that a certain event will occur. There are scenarios, of course, which makes it impossible to conduct research, particularly when the situations involve death of the person or events that must be experienced since birth. Models help decision analysis and promote an explicit and comprehensive validation considering the existing alternatives. They also facilitate the identification of deficiencies in the current evidence. Models are statistically appealing since they help to show the probabilities of occurrence of alternatives, which allows a hypothesis to be tested. The key elements for economic evaluation include the purpose of analysis, the evaluation audience, and in Australia, for example, recommendations for subsidy are made to the Minister of Health, Disability and Aged Care. The perspective of the payer, whether it's the payer or whether it's the payer perspective or the societal perspective, and that determines the costs that are considered. Looks at the time horizon, whether that's over months, years, or lifetime. The population, or who the target population is. The intervention, which is the new health technology. The comparator, which is the alternative technology, or it might be comparing a new therapy or treatment to do nothing or the standard care. And also looking at outcomes, which is what is being measured. and the PICO or PICO is often used in other methods as well. So what can economics help us with? Economic evaluations provide a framework to systematically compare interventions so that all relative alternatives can be clearly identified, analysed and evaluated. And in summary, the main characteristics of models used for economic evaluations, they're a means to represent the complexity of the real world in a simpler and more comprehensive way. They're mathematical structures that represent the clinical and economic outcomes of alternative strategies in patients or populations in different scenarios. It can synthesize data from multiple sources, it accounts for uncertainty, and they focus on the decision to be made, and are increasingly accepted as economic evaluation instruments by regulatory agents. So now we move on to the black box. I really like this model, which ISA have published, and it's a very simple replication of the economic model that's used in health technology assessment processes, and it attempts to describe the internal workings. In this case, the output is an ISA, or an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which indicates to evaluators whether a medical treatment, drug, or intervention provides good value for the cost. A lower ISA means that the new intervention provides additional health benefits, but at a relatively low extra cost, which makes it more cost effective. And a higher ISA means that the added benefit is expensive in comparison to alternatives. If this model was used for a cost utility analysis, the output might be a cost per QALY gained. Just want to spend the last couple of moments of my section to look at the different models, the different boxes within that model, the internal workings, and just provide a little bit more information about what might comprise each of those stages. The model structure is informed by the HTA and regulatory bodies in each jurisdiction. It can also be informed or based on a literature review of previous economic evaluations, which used a similar model. Informed by discount rates, time horizon, and different health states, whether the health states move between stable, progression, death, and tools such as Markov models, decision trees, and microsimulation are typically used for the model structure. And it's at this stage that you usually invite your friends that are health economists or statisticians to become involved and to help you with this process. Looking at the model inputs, there's many different types of inputs, which can include clinical inputs around efficacy and safety, costs such as treatment, medical, societal costs, the health-related quality of life utilities, epidemiology and population information such as incident prevalence rates or different demographics, natural history studies, resource use, comparator characteristics, again looking at cost, effect and resource use, and uncertainty and sensitivity inputs, which help to test the robustness of the model. And of course, patient data, which is what we focused on a little bit earlier. In terms of model calculations, this is statistical and simulation methods to analyse different scenarios, which will depend on the decision trees or Markov models, depending on which model is used. And that will look at different probabilities of moving through different health states. Along with those calculations, it might include a cost effectiveness analysis or cost minimisation analysis, and cost utility is one of the other more common types of calculations. And model assumptions, so really all of the inputs that are used in the model are based on assumptions. So this refers to the explicit choices made to the structure in the economic model. And assumptions matter because they can strongly influence results and therefore must be transparent and justifiable. And as an example of an assumption, if a longer time horizon is used, this increases the uncertainty of costs and outcome over time. So it's at this point that I'll end my presentation and hand over to Sarah, and Sarah will provide an overview of how this is applied in Australia through the Medical Services Advisory Committee. Thank you. Now stop sharing.
Thanks, Cara.
Thank you.
Switch to Righto. So hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people in Sydney, Australia. So as Cara said, I'm just going to be speaking to you today from my perspective on the Medical Services Advisory Committee, which you've already heard a bit about already from Cara. The things I'd like to cover are just to give you an overview of the MSAC process and the types of evidence that are considered, and then we can place how patient data fits within that. And then I will also focus on how patient data is used in the economic analyses that are undertaken by MSAC, and noting too that there are a lot of similarities between MSAC and the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee in terms of the methods that we use. And then I'll also just really end by emphasising the importance of patient evidence and consumer input for MSAC decision making. So just to begin, we have essentially a three-step process within MSAC. So the first step is the PICO Advisory Subcommittee. So you heard from Cara about the PICO. So that basically is a really important step because it frames the question for the overall HTA. So which patients are we talking about? What test or treatment are we talking about? MSAC considers tests as well as treatments. Compared to what? So how are these patients currently managed in the health system? And which health outcomes? Which ones are most relevant to patients? The other thing that the PICO Advisory Subcommittee does is it assesses which type of economic evaluation is most likely to be appropriate. Now, we can't actually determine what type of economic evaluation will be appropriate until we've reviewed all of the evidence, but it can at least set out what the likely approaches will be. Once an application has been received by the Department of Health, then it proceeds through an evaluation process, and it then comes to the Evaluation Subcommittee, or ESC. And what that committee does is they are essentially a technical committee, and they review all of the submitted evidence. So we have clinical evidence, patient evidence, economic evidence, we might have ethical analyses, and we typically have some sort of economic evaluation, quite often a model, as Cara's described. As well as the economics, so that the cost effectiveness, we also look at the financial impact, so the total cost estimates for the new test or treatment. And then we also think about other considerations such as ethical, legal and social implications, and also any organisational implications that might be required if this particular technology is to be implemented. And then what the subcommittee does is it provides advice to the main parent committee, or MSAC, and MSAC then considers all of the evidence and the advice from ESC. It deliberates on the total body of evidence, and I really want to emphasise that because I think some people have the impression that, yes, there is this black box around the economic evaluation and that there's a lot of focus on the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which is what Cara so clearly explained to you. But the ISA is only one piece of information that the committee is deliberating on. The committee then provides its advice to the Federal Minister for Health, and the committee either supports or does not support public funding for the test or treatment, and it provides very clear reasons for its advice. So now if I just go through broadly the evidence domains that are considered by MSAC, and this really just flows on from what you heard from Cara. So we have the clinical evidence. So we're looking at the key features of the condition and its impact on patients, the outcomes that are most relevant to patients, and this is where quality of life impacts feature. We look at the current tests and treatments that are available in Australia, and this is really important because that helps us determine what the comparator is. And then we look at the safety and performance if it's a new test, and then also safety and effectiveness if it's a new treatment. We then have the economic and financial evidence. So really, how much does this new technology cost versus what we're doing already? And then essentially when we're doing a cost effectiveness analysis, we're saying, if this new technology costs more than what we already do, is it worth paying that extra money in order to gain those additional health outcomes for patients? As I say, we are interested in the total cost of the health system, And then we also at MSAC have a particular interest in how much patients will have to pay out of pocket, and I can explain why that's really front and centre for us at MSAC in the questions if you're interested. And then, as I said, there's these other considerations that also come into play. So we're very interested in any equity of access issues, whether this is an area of high unmet clinical need, if there are relevant ethical issues. If it's a test, we also have the concept of value of knowing, which we might consider. And as I mentioned, we also think about organisational aspects. And I just want to highlight that patient data and the consultation feedback and the input we get from our consumer members on all of our subcommittees and our main committee inform and enrich all of these domains. So if we start with the black box in the middle, so the economic analysis, and I think the important thing to remember here is that the economic model in a MSAC evaluation is structured according to the PICO that have been approved by PASC. And it will be based on relevant clinical trial evidence, and as you heard from Cara, data from other sources. And the reason that we do need to do modelling is particularly when important costs or outcomes have not been collected in a clinical trial, or those outcomes need to be transformed into quality adjusted life years. So these are just all the ways in which patient data and consumer inputs are used in the economic analysis. And I've kept my definition quite broad because I think all of these dimensions represent knowledge and they all play a part for MSAC. So the pre-PASS consultation feedback from consumers and patient organisations can directly shape the PICO itself, which in turn then shapes the economics. Let's never forget that patients are the participants in the clinical trials on which everything is based, and patient quality of life and patient experience of receiving that particular technology can be collected directly from those trials and included. You can also collect data on patients' use of a medical technology outside of a trial, and so we're seeing more and more use of what we call real-world data or evidence around that. That can be built into the model. And importantly, as Cara mentioned too, data can also be collected on the cost to patients for their healthcare, and there are many different ways of collecting this information. And this can be extremely informative for the modelling. Patient preferences can be very important as well. I must acknowledge we don't have an explicit method for incorporating them within the model, but if they are provided, they are certainly considered alongside the economic analysis, and they can inform the structure of the model as well. Patient experience as well is another. If we've got patient-reported experience measures, they can also be considered alongside the economics. And then I think the patient descriptions of their experience across all stages of a condition are really important, because quite often a clinical trial might have a subgroup of the population that only goes for a particular length of time, but the model itself wants to capture all of the health states that might occur, and many of which would not have been observed in a clinical trial. And so that's really important for helping us define and what we call populate those health states in the model. And then, as we've heard, patient data on quality of life is really key to allow us to generate quality adjusted life years, and a cost utility analysis, which is when we express the ISA as a cost per QALY. That is the preferred economic analysis for MSAC. So here are just some examples quickly where these are examples of where consumer feedback has really been important for shaping the approach to the MSAC assessment. So here we have a particular treatment for prostate cancer. This is one that's not actually being considered by MSAC yet, but the consumer impact feedback has been really important for framing the PICO. And so what the consumer input has highlighted is the importance of preserving urinary and sexual function for this condition, and so this assessment won't focus solely on cancer outcomes, and we would expect to see that flow through to the economic model as well. This is another one, lutetium PSMA for metastatic prostate cancer. Again, this was supported by very strong consumer feedback because this particular therapy is better tolerated than chemotherapy, and it also reduced the need for palliative care. And so MSAC accepted that it was cost effective in this context, that there was a high clinical need and strong consumer preference over its comparators. This is another one where we had an intragastric balloon for people who were overweight or obese. And this was one actually where the consumer feedback actually was aligned with the decision not to support public funding for this particular technology. And that was really because they provided additional data around the complications that patients had experienced who had received this particular device. And there were some pretty severe adverse events, including chronic vomiting. And then finally, just this is one where we looked at genetic testing for childhood syndromes. And this was one where the economic modelling was actually incredibly difficult because it wasn't, it was a whole array of different syndromes and conditions that were really captured by this application. And so it was very hard to do the economic modelling. But what the consumer feedback provided was really clear guidance on how having those genetic results was really important for reducing the ongoing use of tests and procedures, trying to reach a diagnosis for the child, and also that having that diagnosis could actually allow the child to access support services such as through our National Disability Insurance Scheme. So in this case, even though we could not develop a reliable economic analysis, MSAC still supported the genetic tests for the child and also for their parents. So just to finish, just to sum up, so these are all the kinds of information and evidence that MSAC welcomes, so anything to do with the patient experience of the medical condition and or experience with the service or the technology that is being considered. And it doesn't all have to be good news. And also sometimes what MSAC is really seeking to understand is the uncertainty around particular tests and treatments. And even if we can hear about what the adverse events might be, that doesn't necessarily mean we won't support that technology. It just gives us more certainty around how it's likely to impact on patients. So just to finish, I just want to really emphasise how important consumer input and patient evidence is for MSAC. Really highlight that the earlier in the MSAC process that we receive that input and evidence, the better. So there are actually 3 opportunities for consumer feedback to be received. And just to highlight that the committee works very closely with the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit that's within the Department of Health. And we really are looking at ways that we can improve the methods for collecting and incorporating patient evidence in our HTA processes. And just to thank you to the people who've helped me prepare this presentation, and also a big shout out to all the consumers and consumer organisations who have ever submitted feedback or evidence that is being considered by MSAC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's fantastic to see some real examples of how reimbursement is recommended or not supported in some cases. And I think Australia is very fortunate to have the CEEU body. Not every jurisdiction has a body like that, so we are extremely fortunate in Australia to have that group to support consumers. Thank you so much. Eric, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Cara. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm just doing the technical bit here, which I hope works okay. Alrighty. Well, it's very difficult to follow 2 great speakers with 2 very comprehensive talks, and I knew this was going to happen. So I deliberately tried to offer up something different, which is not easy. I always try and go first in these things, but I often end up last. But hopefully this will be useful. So it's much more pragmatic and less technical, and hopefully quite empowering to the patient organizations and patient advocates online around why health economic modeling is really important and why it needs to take account of more important things, the things that are much more important to patients. And we've heard a lot about that already, so hopefully that's not going to be kind of too repetitive. So actually, my slides are in the wrong order. It's very odd. Yeah, unfortunately, my slides haven't loaded. And you have my slides. I wonder if you
Yeah,
could
if
do
I'll
them,
just bring them up now.
because the first 4 or 5 haven't come up,
Yeah, but
unfortunately.
we've definitely got some more ones here, so we will share those.
I do apologize.
No, we really
Some
appreciate you getting out before dawn
glitch
to do this.
some glitch in the system.
Now, is that right there now? Are you happy to just tell me when you want them moved?
Sure. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, thank you. That's still the wrong slide.
Do you want to have a look on your computer, and we can answer a question while you do that? Would that be helpful?
Sure, no worries.
Okay, while Eric is doing that, Sarah, I might ask you a question straight up myself, if that's okay. Um, Something that I heard for the first time, sort of probably within the last 2 years, was the concept of the value of knowing. And I have a sense of what this refers to, and I know that for myself, I've been able to take preventative health measures due to my own carrier status. But how do health economists attempt to quantify that value of knowing?
It's a very good question, Cara, and the answer is we don't know how to do it yet.
Mm.
And I think that the last version of our MSAC guidelines was the first time that we actually introduced the concept, and we are still working to how we operationalize that. But essentially, it allows for, so when we're thinking about, so it only applies to tests, and it allows for situations where having a test result doesn't immediately result in clinical utility for the individual, but there might be, so for instance, finding out your carrier status is, yes, there's value in knowing that, but there's actually a direct clinical utility from that because you can take measures to reduce your risk. So we would say in that particular instance, there actually is a clinical utility as well as a value of knowing. So the value of knowing comes into play in particular in situations where, so for instance, the example I showed you with the childhood syndromes, it wouldn't make any difference to how that child was being managed, but it just having that diagnosis, having a molecular diagnosis, allowed access to non-health services.
Yes.
And so it sits outside our usual framing of clinical utility. So we're using it in a quite a sort of qualitative way at the moment. So it hasn't quite made it into being a quantitative economic construct yet.
Yeah, okay. Well, I look forward to that time when we are able to quantify it and really incorporate that into models. Thank you. Eric, it looks like
All
you're ready
right,
to go. Are you okay
I'm
now?
good to go. I do apologize. I don't even know how it
Okay.
happened, but the first few slides were hidden, and I didn't even know you could do that. So I don't know. There's definitely a glitch in the system. So I'm sorry to everybody for the inconvenience.
Not at all. Thank you,
Okay,
Eric.
I'll whiz through this. So the problem with HTA and the problem with health economic models is the evidence gap, and both Sarah and Cara have alluded to this, that we often have very limited evidence to put into the health economic model. That's partly why industry and HTA bodies scramble around at the 11th hour, trying to find more data, trying to find data from patients to help. And I don't know, I feel it's a little disrespectful because, this research has been done for the past 5 or 10 years. Why didn't we speak to patients right at the beginning, right at the trial design, right at the model design, and that often isn't the case. So the problem that all HTA agencies deal with across the world is this evidence gap, and it's partly because industry design clinical trials to answer regulatory questions. And it's even worse than that. It's regulatory questions for the FDA because in the US, unfortunately, or fortunately, 60 to 70% of pharma profits come from the US market. So they're obsessed, rightly, because they're commercial entities, on generating evidence to fit the needs of the FDA. The problem for that is that means most trials don't have the evidence that's needed for other decision makers downstream in the healthcare system, including HTA bodies, but also commissioners and people that are responsible for developing treatment pathways in the real world. And this is why economic modeling is important. It's why generally patient advocacy and patient level data is important, because we've got to fix this. We need better data. We need more better data to make sure that every decision maker in the ecosystem has the data and evidence it needs to make the best decision. And quite often, the decision that an HTA body makes is the decision that's implemented into the clinic. But we have to remember that that decision is largely being made on the basis of a regulatory evidence base. And these trials, it's like a minimal viable product. It's the minimum amount of data needed to get over the line. It doesn't actually tell us how well a treatment works in the long term. It doesn't tell us how treatments work in all patients. It often doesn't account for the fact of how many previous treatments patients might have or how many future treatments they might have. So all of this is kind of quite risky. And I think what we're all collectively saying here is that patient evidence and patient data can improve all of this, improve the data that's in the system. And because of these evidence gaps, the same evidence that travels through the system can lead to markedly different decisions with different decision makers. And we've heard this from Sarah and from Cara. I've just sort of put it in a sort of kind of cartoon, is that the evidence that's collected in these regulatory trials is kind of nothing. It really isn't nothing. Sometimes it's 100 patients in a single arm trial. And it feels a little bit it feels like, you know, it's the old iceberg analogy, that the bit you see in the trial is the bit above the water, whereas the reality for patients is much different. The reality for healthcare systems, clinicians, other members of the multidisciplinary team is very different, but this is not ever captured in clinical trials sufficiently, which is why the cells in health economic models are often empty, or it's very difficult for that economic model to truly reflect the real world scenario. And for HTA bodies, it's very difficult for them to really understand what is going on in the trial, what is going on in the model, and how does that relate to real world clinical practice and the perspectives and the perceptions, needs, wants, benefit risk ratios of patients in the real world that aren't really reflected in the small clinical trial population. And the cartoon on the right hand side is so simple, but it sort of captures it very well, is that, you know, we talk a little bit about assumptions, and a lot of what's in a model is assumptions because we don't have the evidence, which is kind of crazy. But who are making these assumptions on behalf of patients, their carers? It's generally not them. It's generally health economists or clinicians. But if anybody knows anything about patients in the real world, the perspective of their clinician is very different to the perspective of the patient. And this cartoon, I think, highlights it very well. The same scenario, the same picture, but two very different perspectives. And then I've stolen this from Cara and Sarah. Is this kind of black box? Because it isn't just the model that feels a bit black box. The whole sort of concept of HTA feels a bit like a black box for the very vast majority of patient organizations. Despite best efforts in Australia, Canada, the UK about doing better to involve patients in the process, it still feels like a black box, and people sit there scratching their heads thinking, why am I here? Am I making a contribution? I don't understand 90% of what's been discussed in the committee meeting. But what I'm hearing is that unless the inputs into the model are good, the outputs aren't going to be very good. And that, I think, is what Cara said early on. So there's this dark art, not just of economic modeling, but of HTA. And this is a very risky slide. I've never used it before, but I use the analogy all of the time from a patient perspective. It's a bit like that ham and eggs analogy, is that the chicken is only involved, but the pig is fully committed. And it feels like in all of this evidence development and all of the economic modeling and all of the design of it and the assumptions and everything that goes through HTA, patients are the eggs. We're kind of involved. But the system, it doesn't fully commit us into it in a way that we have no option, that we're fully committed. And I think that has to change. And it's not just the responsibility of HTA bodies to involve patients. If patients and patient evidence has not materially shaped and informed the pivotal study or any associated or parallel studies, we're not going to get the utility values very easily to go into the model. And therefore, HTA bodies can try very hard to get the contextual information from patients about burden of disease, but unless that's included in the model, it's very difficult to despite some good examples from Australia that we just heard from Sarah, to really impact on decision making. So we don't all want to be the pig, but you get the idea is that we need to be more committed to involving patient and appreciating, respecting patient evidence in using it throughout the entire trial design, evidence generation process, not just in the decision making as we try to interpret the results. And this is what happens. And I know Stella's on the call from NICE, and I've done a gazillion NICE appraisals. And it's all about, and Sarah mentioned, it's about risk and uncertainty. It's incredible that after a 10 or even 15-year evidence development period, it's not until we get to HTA that we realize that we have huge risks and uncertainty in the data. It seems bizarre that we should invest so much time and effort only for a very smart HD body to say, hey, you don't really have much data here. We don't really understand it. We don't know what's happening. We're struggling to interpret it on behalf of the health system in future patients. And it's kind of quite obvious if the underlying trial design is flawed, then the model will struggle. And then we put all this pressure on patients and patient advocates to somehow wave a magic wand and get experiential data or care utility data and think this is going to make a massive difference. If it's not embedded throughout the whole process, it's going to really struggle to make a difference. And so what happens is that you come to HT with all this risk and uncertainty, and therefore the value proposition is pretty weak, actually, overall to all downstream stakeholders. And this is what we would propose very practically. And sorry for the another kind of cartoon, is that the typical system is very linear. We think about it as bench to bedside. We hear bench to bedside all the time, but actually we should be proponents of from patients to research and back again, where we're systematically outside of, not just within an appraisal, collecting patient level data consistently and systematically using good methods and feeding that back into the system all of the time and making it very difficult for that data to be ignored by those that have responsibility for making the rules, doing methods, doing process, and designing research. So my big shout out is that as patient advocates and research organizations, we shouldn't just generate this data to help with assumptions and the interpretation of trials. We should be generating it to make sure that the evidence in the first place is much more reflective of the needs, wants, perspectives, and trade-offs that patients have. And we kind of need to get these regulatory studies in better shape. I won't, in the interest of time, talk too much about this, but there's just a collection of kind of images that all bring to life some of the things we've heard from Cara and Sarah, is that, you know, when we're thinking about assumptions and models, it's sort of the elephant in the room. The patient isn't really represented. It's quite often clinicians that are in the room. telling companies and telling decision makers what their patients think. But it's only really patients and their caregivers that know and understand how disease impacts on daily life and how a treatment or management strategy will influence its quality one way or the other. I'm very conscious of the time and we need sort of kind of questions, and it's my fault for the kind of slides. But to make the point is and Sarah kind of did this really, really well, as did Cara, is the model structure determines what patient-based evidence matters. So we can run around and spend all kinds of resources investing in generating patient evidence data, but if it's not mapped against or fits against the model structure, it's very difficult for HTA bodies to really interpret that and for it to influence the kind of decision. But what we know is, and Tara's given some really good examples, that if we have the right evidence from patients and caregivers, and it's collected properly through robust methods, and it's fed into the system at the correct stage, it can dramatically improve the basis on which decisions are made, and it can make a model, it can turn a model from good to great by more accurately reflecting the factors that are important to kind of patients and their carers. So in a way, this sort of means that as a bunch of sort of patient advocates around the kind of world, we kind of need to change the emphasis of our advocacy to move from trying to find a way into and impacting decision making at an HTA level and getting involved in determining and shaping and creating the framework in which evidence development should happen in the first place. And fundamentally, we need to get beyond generating evidence solely for the regulator, because it's not enough anymore. It's never been enough. It isn't just about safety. It's about real world efficiency and making sure we've got a greater understanding of the impact, positively and negatively, that new treatments and technologies have in patients. And what typically happens in the UK, and it kind of is good and bad, is that uncertainty, there's always uncertainty, but a lot of the uncertainty can be bought off by a discount. So, if company wants X, but the ICER is high, the system allows companies to buy off that uncertainty, and that buys off the financial toxicity, but the uncertainties still remain. They don't disappear. These gaps in data still exist, and that burden is on patients and their carers in the real world who are having to make decisions about whether to take a treatment or not. So we need better ways to reduce that uncertainty. It shouldn't be that we can just buy off all of the uncertainty. I think patients deserve better. So this is what happens. I'm going to skip forward. That in theory, if we did a better job of generating the right evidence for the right decision maker, and we put patients at the center of this, and we were able to incorporate high quality patient evidence and data to shape research design, research implementation, and help shape decisions that decision makers make in all areas of the system, we would come to the clinic with a greater value proposition and less risk and uncertainty. I'll stop there. And I'm very sorry that I had to rush through that, but in the interest of getting some questions, I had to do it. So hopefully it was helpful.
Thank you, Eric, very much. I'm always fascinated how you can present the information in a very different way to the standard textbook definition and process. And I do have a question for you, but before that, I just want to make reference to your ham and egg slide because I think that's very clever. And what I didn't mention in my information was the important for an Australian process and economic model is really important for Australia to translate the data for the Australian context, particularly for clinical trial data or rare disease data that's typically conducted overseas. And so if I could take just a moment to translate your ham and eggs into the Australian context, we'd be talking about bacon and eggs.
Yeah. Actually, my son walked in because I did the slides late last night. My son walked in and he's like, "Shouldn't it be bacon and eggs?" He said, "That's bacon." I was
Sure.
like, oh, "Okay."
If I may actually ask a real question, you talked a couple of times about carers, which Sarah and I didn't actually. And I wanted to ask what was your view around that definition of the burden of disease, and particularly carer burden. And, what are your thoughts around how that should be measured and incorporated into HTA and specifically economic modelling?
No, it's a great question, and I think we need to be careful about incorporating carer burden into HTA decision making around a treatment that's aimed at the patient. Because at some point, the quality gains in carers are often can be more impressive than the quality gains in patients. And then you realize that actually the technology under appraisal isn't the solution to the carer burden. There might be more cost-effective ways to deal with the carer burden, which is to give them respite.
Mm.
So it's really important to incorporate to get the full picture of the impact that a disease has on not just carers but on siblings if it's a childhood disease. But it needs to be within kind of proper decision-making parameters so that the focus is on the patient, not on the kind of carer. And I think the HTA bodies have got a good understanding of that. But also, it's more about what's measured in clinical trials. So, for example, if if there's not a carer endpoint in a trial, it's not that helpful. So, if a disease keeps a patient awake at night, say itching, and it keeps the patient awake at night, and as a consequence, the carer or the parent is also awake at night, and you have a treatment for itch, and you measure the reduction in itch in patients, if you measured the improvement in sleep in the carer, then you've got a really good solid endpoint, and that's very, very seldom done. So I think there's lots and lots of work to do in terms of how we think about the burden that disease has on carers and family members, how it's measured, and how that supports the evaluation of the technology.
Thank you very much. And I might just check in with you. Do you have any questions from
Look,
the chat in the last couple of
we've got
minutes?
lots of discussion going on, which actually we love in the chat, but I know that's a bit hard for you who are presenting. But there's a question here I wanted to pull out from Rosalina. She was asking about the Ishbor value flower and whether people had experience of using that. And I'll pop a link there in the chat for those who aren't familiar with that. But Sarah, whether that's something that MSAC looks at, and Eric, whether you've got any reflections on that would be terrific.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Rosalina, for the question. Look, I think there's many elements. We don't ever specifically refer to the value, the ISPOR value flower, but there are many of those petals are embedded in our approach anyway. And so we've actually been talking about, I mentioned some of them, so questions around equity, thinking about value of knowing. We've just been talking about family spillovers, so we can certainly think about spillover effects. That's certainly possible within our current framing. So I think, and severity of disease is certainly something that will be front of mind, and usually if it's an unmet clinical need as well. So I think there are many elements, so there are many petals, but yes, we wouldn't refer specifically to the flower.
Yeah, and just to jump in, it's a sort of, I think it's a helpful guide to work within. But even just in severity, I mean, NICE have a severity modifier, and it's really challenging to implement it because severity means different things to different people. And you can have exactly the same disease, the same pain scores, but experience the pain very differently. So these things are great to provide a framework for thinking, but you need to really, really drill down to specific value elements within each therapeutic area, and try and figure it out from an evidence-based perspective. And I would just say one thing as well is the distinction between equality and equity. Equality means that all patients with X get the same. Equity means that all patients with X get what they need through a personalized medicines lens, and that is very different. And we're not very good yet at the equity bit. We're getting better at the equality bit, but we're not getting better at the equity bit. And it's partly going back to the clinical trial because it's for the whole population rather than stratified for different patients with different risk categories, different variations of the disease, or different lifestyles that require a different, more personalized treatment approach.
Can I cheat being, I'm not supposed to do this, I'm supposed to read other people's questions, but I wanted to ask Eric about that model that you were showing there for what I think of as patient knowledge or patient-generated data running through the system. And it reflects on the things that Sarah was showing that MSAC had learnt during their process as well. And what always worries me is that at the moment all this data comes in late. I think you make that point so clearly. And it comes in ways that sometimes are not used or can't be used. But then I worry where it goes, because we talk about a life cycle, but I'm not really seeing how that knowledge is going back in and shaping the priorities and the research and building the new evidence. But have you seen good examples of that?
Yes, yes. So I think rather biased towards the work I've done in the past, particularly at Myeloma UK, where we did preference studies, we built clinical trial networks to de-risk regulatory, we generated data, and that data was then used by NICE to reduce uncertainty. So there are good examples, and I know Sarah had some, but it's not mainstream. They're exceptions. It's not how we do business around here, and I think it frustrates me a little bit. And even I'm a huge fan and champion of NICE, and I can tell you in 30 years, well, not 30 years, 25 years, let's say, of I don't think I've influenced one decision at NICE, and I'm pretty good at what I do sometimes. I get lucky, and sometimes I can be quite smart. And I don't believe I've really influenced a kind of decision, but NICE always point to examples where patients have made the decision, but it's that equity thing. It doesn't happen all of the time. It doesn't happen in every appraisal. The impact that the patient level evidence has is different in every appraisal context. And that's frustrating as well.
Eric, I think as someone who sits on the committees, I share your frustration too, because in Australia we have a very reactive HTA process. So we're very much, what gets submitted is what gets evaluated.
Yeah,
And so it can be
absolutely.
very frustrating that, the number of times we sit around at the subcommittee and the committee saying, why haven't we got, there's no reason why we haven't we couldn't get patient evidence in this situation. So, yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the HTA bodies get the blame for this.
They
But
do,
they're doing the
but
very
also,
best they can with the evidence they have.
yeah, but also we don't, we're very mindful of, we don't want to put extra burden on patient organisations.
Yep.
So I think, it's a very hard balance.
It sure is.
I'm sorry we can't keep talking. I'm going to hand to Cara in a moment, and then I'll actually bring up some slides. I've got 2 slides for those who've hung on the call. It's such a terrific conversation. I'm sorry to end it. I'll hand to you, Cara, and then I'll do those last 2 slides and close out.
Hmm.
You're on mute.
If I'm not on mute, yes. Sorry, we have run a little bit over time. I just wanted to personally thank all of the sponsors that support Patient Voice Initiative, and obviously I've had the tremendous privilege of being part of receiving that sponsorship with my participation in the Patient Voice program for this year. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And I've got the sponsors up there well, so we've earned our we've done it right today. But we are really grateful to our sponsors, and we like to be really upfront and transparent about who's given us money, and you can also always check that out on our website. I want to thank the speakers today. I firstly want to, actually, I'm just going to stop the share because it's quite a huge slide I've got there. And I want to thank firstly Sarah Norris. Sarah, some of you will know very well, and as was really evident in the discussion today, it's sometimes a really overlooked part of our HTA system, and yet medical services are such a key part of our lives. And so we were really glad to have the opportunity to focus in on MSAC again, and also to see those real examples, which we know that Australian patient communities are really keen to see. So I really appreciate your time there, Sarah. Eric, you must have got up well before 6 a.m. this morning, and I know it's freezing over there in the UK. And we're really grateful for that. And one of the things we've loved about supporting the Patient Voice Partnership Program in Patient Voice Initiative is it enables us to work with people like Cara who are incredibly driven and focused in their interest in this area, have taken their interest to the whole level of doing a Masters of Health Economics, and then wanted to do a shared project with us and wanted to excite other people about health economics instead of just saying, oh, look, it is that black box. Actually, let me engage you with this and why it matters. And so really appreciate that, Cara, and also really appreciate that because of the Patient Voice Partnership and the way it's driven is the idea is that the person who gets the partnership has their questions and their goals that they want to take forward, and we're there to support and encourage, but we're not there to tell them how they should have their journey in this area. Excuse the use of the word journey. And so it's great when they go to HTAI and they meet people like Eric and get really inspired by what he's talking about. And then that feeds back into our community. So Eric, we appreciate how you share your knowledge on the international stage, and we appreciate you bringing it to Australia for us this morning because it really stimulates the conversation here and helps us move forward. And so with that, I will mention the Patient Voice Partnerships for 2026 are about to open. It involves working on a project with shared goal, reimbursed, and we'll cover 3 patients to go to Istanbul in June 2026. And I know Cara's probably pretty happy to talk to anyone about what the experience is like. We will keep improving it. I know we're well over time, but I have to show you one more slide. Just bear with me, and I'll put it up. And it's not this one again, but it is this one, which is just to let you all know, going back to medicines, that the new PBAC agenda is up. That's going to be for next March's meeting. You can follow that QR code and you'll go into that site that Alicia was flagging in the chat before, and you can see what medicines and what conditions have medicines being looked at in the March meeting and how to get involved. And if you don't know where to start with getting involved and finding out more about HTA, you can follow the other QR code to our hub. You can always send us an email if you want to follow up with any of our speakers. I can see that they're making themselves available, and so that's an option as well. And in January, we will also have a do's and don'ts of consumer input webinar. So if you know of people who are having to do it for the first time, it's January and most people have gone to the beach and they don't know where to start, let them know that that's on. So with that, I really will release everyone back into their days. And again, thank you to you all.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Cara.